Good morning. I am Heather Herring, the Education Manager at the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. I want to warmly welcome you to our summer webinar series. Today, we will explore legislative updates. Do you need professional credits? You can receive 1 hour of professional development credit by participating in this live webinar and completing the short survey at the end. Our webinars are being recorded and will be made available for those who registered. Continue your learning with these webinars all summer long. Please visit our website at NRRA-recycles.org for more information. Here's some additional information on our webinars. For recycling facility operators, we have our operator track webinars from which to choose from. And for our educators, administrators, and community members, we have our community track webinars. We've separated our webinars according to interest groups, but all NRRA members and not yet members are welcome to participate in any and all of our webinar offerings. I'd like to set the table for this GoToWebinar. Webinar participants will not be able to be heard by the presenters or other participants during this presentation. If you cannot hear the presenters' voices, please click on the audio arrow in your control panel and choose computer audio. If that does not work, please select phone call option and follow the directions. We hope that you'll ask questions and our presenters will do their best to answer them as time allows. Click on the question block in the control panel and type in your questions. Please keep questions short and to the point. I'd also like to bring your attention to the handouts for this webinar. They can be found in the control console. You're welcome to view, download, or both. Here's a little bit about NRRA. We are a recycling nonprofit. We have 400 members, primarily municipalities, and we were founded nearly 40 years ago. So what do? We do cooperative marketing and purchasing. We enable communities to manage their own recycling programs and offer over 40 programs, including single stream and municipal solid waste. And we connect sellers of recyclables to purchasers. We also provide education and technical assistance through workshops, facility tours, annual conference and webinars like these, technical assistance, and a school club program. And now I would like to introduce our panel for today, Cathy Jamieson, who's the Solid Waste Program Manager from the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, and Ariela Lovett, a legislative analyst with the Massachusetts Municipal Association. On behalf of NRA, I would like to welcome you to our summer webinar series and turn the presentation over to you. Welcome, Cathy.
Thank you very much, Heather.
Sure.
And to be here. Today, I'd like to cover several pieces of Vermont legislation that has been passed that helps us properly manage and encourage great recycling of solid waste and various materials. Next, please. Thank you. So the programs I'd like to cover today are in 3 categories: extended producer responsibility programs. And the second is our universal recycling program that targets both recycling and food waste. Today I'll focus on the food waste portion of that. And thirdly, our single-use products law. Next. So with our EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility Programs, first I'll back up and share a little bit about what these programs are in case you're not familiar. It's basically a shared responsibility model so that rather than consumers or taxpayers being responsible for paying for the management of goods or products once the consumer's done with them, it's a shared process where the manufacturers often are required to have a program and a collection, and either pay for the collection or the proper recycling of the materials. Retailers help inform consumers on how to participate in the programs. Consumers have the responsibility of properly managing the material when they're done with it, and the government usually has the oversight of the program. Next. There are several states throughout the country that have, over the course of the last 10 to 20 years, adopted various EPR programs. And as you can see by this map, the different colors reflect how many programs are in each state. And we have a fair number of programs that have been adopted in the Northeast. Next, please. And why would one want to have an EPR program? Well, first of all, next, there's a real benefit in the actual convenience. By having convenient collection throughout the state, we have found that we have an improved collection rate of these materials. We have vastly increased the collection of our electronics, our paint, mercury-added products, batteries. So it really helps keep these materials from disposal or from inappropriate management and have them properly recycled. Next. The other benefit is that the cost. So rather than the entire cost being on the burden of the consumer or the local government for managing these materials, either through disposal or other recycling options, the manufacturer helps in participating in sharing these costs. So that's a real benefit. So over the last few years, we have saved, we in Vermont can save consumers and municipalities hundreds of thousands of dollars for managing these materials. Next, please. And it also incentivizes the manufacturer and the product design, because if the manufacturer now is responsible for helping to pay for the recycling, then there's an incentive for these materials to be produced and manufactured in a way so that they're easier, less costly to recycle. Next. So in Vermont, we have several programs. That the top tier indicates mercury added products. A long time ago, we had the mercury switches in automobiles. Those have been phased out of manufacturing, but we are still collecting a few of those in the older model cars. We have the mercury added thermostats. As those get replaced with the newer modern technology, there's a lot of mercury in these thermostats, so it's important to make sure that's removed from the environment, as well as the mercury added lamps that are now getting phased out with the replacement to and upgrading to LED lamps. Our electronic waste EPR program has been hugely successful. We are now celebrating the 10th year of having that program, and throughout Vermont, we collect between, we measure it in pounds because we pay by the pound for the recycling of it. So every year we collect between 4 to 5 million pounds of electronic waste, and the collection and recycling costs are being paid for entirely by the electronics manufacturers. Likewise with paint, we have a very successful paint program where paint is now collected at many of our paint retailers, as well as our local drop-offs. And the paint care program, the stewardship organization, is paying for the recycling of the unused paint. And more recently, we have an EPR program for batteries, and Call to Recycle is also collecting not only the primary batteries, which is part of the law, but also collecting the rechargeable batteries as well as cell phones. So next. So that is in summary our EPR programs. And before I jump into universal recycling, I meant to also cover that those are current legislative programs. We also have proposed legislatively an HHW, Household Hazardous Waste EPR program, where in 2018, a bill did pass our legislative house. Unfortunately, there was not sufficient time in the session for that to get any play in the Senate. And that was the end of that legislative session, so it's starting over again in the legislature in Vermont. We also have a proposal, it's called S227, that's currently in our legislature being considered. That has a variety of solid waste topics, and included in that is a proposal to create a bill for consideration, not to pass the legislation, but a bill, have a bill considered for next year's legislature that would consider the aspects of EPR for printed materials, paper, and single-use products. So that's also being considered. Okay, moving on. Universal recycling law was passed in 2012, and it focuses on recyclables and food waste. Next, please. And why do we care? Why do we focus on recyclables and food waste? Well, when you look at what we throw away, which is determined every 5 years in Vermont through a waste composition study, we find that the large portion, more than half of the material that we throw away in Vermont, could either be recycled or managed through organics with composting or diversion. And just the food waste portion alone, that pie chart of 24.4% of organics, of that, and that has leaf and yard debris as well as other materials. But if you look at how much of that is just food waste, in Vermont, we're throwing away approximately 77,000 tons a year of food waste. And of that 77,000 tons, half of that comes from residential sources. Next, please. So there's a lot going on in our universal recycling law. And in a nutshell, basically, there are requirements, and those are what we call bans. So a ban is when that material can no longer be thrown away. And so it was phased in over time, first targeting certain recyclables, then leaf and yard and clean wood. And then the food part of it was phased in over time, starting with 2014 with the largest of generators, moving all the way down to the smaller and smaller generators to just this year, this summer, to all generators, including residential generators. So no longer can food waste be thrown away in Vermont. So whenever you have a ban, or whenever you have an EPR program, or whenever you have a program like that, we have found in Vermont the most important part is having convenience. If you want it being managed in a way other than disposal, you have to make it super easy for people to manage. And so the key aspect of the universal recycling law was making sure that there was convenient collection for everybody throughout the state. And so wherever MassDEP, wherever trash is being managed in the state, so whether it's at your curbside with a hauler or at a facility, a transfer station where you have a drop off, they have to also offer the collection of the certain materials. And so this was phased in over time with recyclables first, then leaf and yard, and then food residuals. Now, I have to say that the law had been changed a few times over the years to modify the hauler provision. And so initially, haulers were required to offer the leaf and yard provision to their customers. That was removed later. So that's no longer a requirement. And also the food residuals collection, the food scrap collection, haulers are not responsible for offering collection to residents, the residential, the household customers. They do have to offer collection to apartments with 4 or more units and all of their non-residential customers if another hauler in that area is not providing the service. We also have other incentives to take the bulky materials like recyclables or the heavy materials like the food waste out of the trash with pay-as-you-throw across the state. And then with recycling, we have public space recycling. So there's a lot in this law. Next, please. And we've had, like I said, 8 years to phase it in over time, to help build up the infrastructure, to help build up the services. And we just last month on July 1st, implemented the statewide ban on the food scrap disposal. Next, please. And Vermont's not alone, though. We have multiple states, several in New England, that are targeting organics, targeting these food scraps. Most of these states are targeting the larger generators. Vermont is the only state that goes all the way down to the residential level. And again, the reason why Vermont decided to go to that level was that nearly half of the food waste Vermonters throw away are, that's coming from households. So if we wanted to make significant progress in removing food waste from disposal, we had to target residential sources. Next, please. So what are the benefits of mandatory food waste programs? Next. So you have increases in food donation, and this is really important. So that first slide I showed said wasted food and food waste, and there's a big difference in the terms. So we have in America, we waste about 40% of the food that is grown, and that's significant. And so when you walk into a retail grocery store and you see a perfect produce section, that is because many pieces of fruits and vegetables have been culled out that are perfectly edible, but they just don't fit that perfect picture scene. So by promoting and requiring that these materials be removed from the disposal, you are providing an incentive to donate these very edible foods to those in need. And so it's a win-win-win. We're helping people with food insecurity by culling out that material from the disposal or even just composting costs. That helps decrease the cost of the generators have on disposal, and it also provides them with a tax benefit. Next. So another incentive is that when materials can no longer be thrown away, and this is true with food waste as well as other materials, when there is a ban on disposal, you are sending a clear signal to those that wish to invest that there is these materials will be available, and the infrastructure can then be built that needs to be in place to manage these materials. Next. And it also helps divert a significant portion of the waste stream from the landfill, which helps with landfill capacity, as well as, next, greenhouse gas emissions, where we have, through the EPA WARM model, determined that if you took that 77,000 tons of food waste Vermonters throw away every year, and even if you didn't reduce any of it by feeding it to those in need, and you composted it all, and you included the transportation impacts from taking it to a composting facility, you still see significant decreases in greenhouse gas emissions, even when that landfill has methane to energy conversion, because landfills are not wholly efficient, completely efficient at converting methane to energy. And so we determined that by making that diversion, it's equivalent to taking 9,500 vehicles off the road every year. Next. So what does this look like? It's a closed loop system rather than a linear system where we put it in the landfill and it's never seen again. It's closed loop, just like recycling. Next. And in the back of the house, it's not as messy as you've seen. So in restaurants, they have buckets, and those buckets can go back out to toters. Next, please. And we have a campaign going on social media. I encourage you to go look at our website, and we have a 30-second video, which kind of explains to the Vermont public why it's important to manage food and food scraps appropriately. And our tagline is "Eat what you buy, compost the scraps." And just so you know that in America, it's been estimated that families are wasting about $1,500 worth of food that they could otherwise eat. So if you really are conscious about reducing food waste, which has the best environmental impact when you reduce the waste that's generated, you can also save money. And hey, who doesn't want to save money, right? And then we'll always have some sort of food scraps, the edible things, the, watermelon rinds and whatnot. And so those should be composted or managed appropriately. Next. And we have convenience. Like I said, again, it's really important to have convenient collection. And so throughout the state, we have transfer stations. Some of you folks probably call them drop-offs. And so the law required that wherever the trash was being managed, that you also have to collect recycling as well as food scraps. So throughout Vermont, we have a little over 100 transfer stations. And so now we have over 100 locations where recycling and food scraps can be conveniently collected. And the circles that have the numbers on them, those indicate composting sites. And over the last few years, we've had more facilities go online. And so we have about 24 composting facilities, or ADs, anaerobic digesters, that can accept food scraps. Next. Moving on. So the third topic are single-use products. And in Vermont, last year, 2019, Act 69 was passed that targeted plastic bags, plastic straws and stirrers, and styrofoam or expanded styrene food and beverage containers. Next. And of course, we've all seen these horrific pictures of what happens when plastics or single-use products gets out into the environment, causing detrimental harm to aquatic biota, to animals, birds, and also breaks down into little pieces of plastic, but it doesn't really biodegrade. So it stays in the environment for hundreds of years, it's been estimated, continuing to cause impacts. Next, please. And so you'll see throughout the country that in multiple countries over the globe that they have targeted plastic bags. And so Vermont also is targeting that. So no longer at retailers or takeout food from restaurants can plastic bags, single-use plastic bags, be used. And that was effective July 1, so just last month. So we were super busy implementing these two new provisions. And so, of course, when you're in the produce section, and there's a couple other exemptions that those smaller plastic bags can still be used, but it's at the point of sale, at the checkout, that those bags can no longer be used. Next, if a consumer forgets to bring a bag, they can still get a large paper bag at a charge of 10 cents. And that's to incentivize people to bring reusable bags, because there's less impact on the environment with a reusable bag being used. We also have a provision in the law, though, however, if there's smaller paper bags like the lunch size bags, there's no charge for those. Next. We have a campaign going on. We're working closely with the Vermont Retailers and Grocers Association on reminding people to bring their own bag, as well as next. It's important, though, if we're using reusable bags, to clean them. There was a lot of misinformation that came out during the pandemic. There was misinformation that people thought they could get COVID from using reusable bags. We work very closely with our own Vermont Health Department on that. They determined that using a reusable bag, and this has also been stated by other experts in the field, as well as CDC, that it poses no more risk than any other surface that we touch. And when you go to a retail store, think of all the items you're touching to put in your grocery cart, and then you're touching again to put on the conveyor belt. It's no more risk than that. But like anything that we use, we should use good hygiene and clean our bags periodically. Next. And so with single-use products, Act 69 also had us create a working group that met over last summer and came up with a number of recommendations. And so this group, rather than coming up with 1 or 2 recommendations, each member of the group that participated got to add recommendations to a list. So the report has a list of about 20 different recommendations that could be used to reduce or better manage single-use products. And from that came a bill that's pending our legislature right now. It's called S227. It now targets materials, the plastic bottles that you get at lodging or hotels that are used for single-use shampoo or soap, and those would be phased in over time if passed by the entire legislature and approved by the governor. That has passed the Senate, and in that bill, as I mentioned, is a provision to prepare for consideration additional legislation that would target other single-use products. Next, please. And so with that, that's kind of a world-worn tour of the significant solid waste legislation that Vermont has passed in order to help us improve management in the state of Vermont. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cathy, for that wonderful presentation. I want to switch over. We'll hold our questions until the end, but I wanted to switch over to Ariela Lovett from Massachusetts to provide some insight on what's happening in Massachusetts.
Wonderful. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So good morning. My name is Ariela Lovett, and I am with the Massachusetts Municipal Association, which is a different type of entity than Cathy's. So I wanted to start by just explaining what the role of a municipal association or municipal league does, or what the role is, excuse me. And there is one in every state except for Hawaii. So, you know, whoever is on the webinar, it'll have some relevance to your state. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, so this is the agenda that I'll follow. As I said, provide an intro to what we do and talk about some challenges, solutions, and debates related to solid waste and recycling issues, specific to Massachusetts, but also relevant to the region and the country and even the globe. Next slide, please. So the Massachusetts Municipal Association, similar to other municipal leagues, works with municipal officials across the state. We are a member-based organization for municipal officials. We have 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. And so, you know, our membership staff works with folks based on municipal roles. So whether you're a mayor, a town manager, a select board member, a city councilor, et cetera. And then I work on the legislative team, and we represent the policy interests of local government and of the municipal officials, you know, who are part of our network. And we do that by being an intermediary between the municipalities and local government. And these three entities, you know, broadly defined the state legislature, the governor's administration, and also the nonprofit and private sectors, which is obviously, you know, a broad category. But we are a go-between representing the, you know, collective interests of the cities and towns and their municipal officials. We work very closely with the state legislature and also with, you know, entities like the equivalent in Massachusetts, the Department of Environmental Protection, Department of Transportation, agencies like that. Next slide, please. So I cover environmental issues and also transportation issues, you know, in my policy portfolio for the MMA. And so I thought that I would explain a little bit about, you know, what some of the challenges are that our municipal officials and municipalities more broadly are facing related to solid waste and recycling, and then go into how we address, you know, exploring various solutions or, you know, advocacy points to, you know, help address many of these challenges. So China National Sword, I imagine that most of the folks on this call are very familiar with this, but it started affecting our municipalities upwards of 2 years ago, in the the trickle down effect it had on the global recycling market, and so we started to hear from our chief municipal officials about bullet point number 2, the increasing cost of municipal recycling contracts. So this is what we were hearing directly from the folks who lead our cities and towns in elected or appointed capacities, and who are responsible for managing the budget and managing these contracts, who were seeing that in some cases the towns were getting paid for the recycling, and then it would net zero, and then they would have this huge increase in the contract price, and all of a sudden they have to pay tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, which makes a really big impact on the bottom line of even a larger town or a city, when that's something that you didn't have to budget for originally, and then all of a sudden it's the new reality. And we knew it wasn't specific to Massachusetts. This was a real unprecedented global change in the recycling markets, but our municipal officials were really feeling it back home. And then also some of the things that Cathy brought up about the harms of single-use and ubiquitous plastics. There's really a rising awareness of that, especially on the residential level, but also then that goes up to the municipal official level, and really feeling like we need to start getting behind restrictions or bans or better management of these products, so that we can avoid the environmental and public health, negative environmental and public health impacts that they have. And so even in the past few years in Massachusetts, there's really been a shift in the momentum of municipal officials and the state, to get behind some of these changes. I mean, what I'm about to tell you is we're nowhere near where Vermont is. So it was very impressive to hear about everything that's been passed in Vermont. We are not there yet, but I'll go through some of the things that we're considering. Next slide, please. So this is an overview slide of various solutions that I'm going to talk about, and then each of them have their own slide. So I won't go through each of them individually on this slide, but I'll just move into the first solution that I'll talk about with EPR. Next slide, please. So Cathy did a really good job of setting you up to understand what EPR is. So I'm not gonna, repeat what she said, but I'll talk about it from a Massachusetts context. So we, Cathy spoke about product-specific EPR legislation, different categories or programs, where different categories of products or items where, the state will collect them so that they're recycled or processed appropriately. And so kind of the big legislation this season for extended producer responsibility was actually broader legislation having to do with we call EPR for packaging. And so there were two main approaches that were presented that we, the NMA and our members engaged with. And so one was coming out of the Conservation Law Foundation, which also operates in the rest of New England, so folks might be familiar with them. And another bill was being filed by a regional recycling cooperative. And so these would be really like broad scale bills to establish a product stewardship or extended producer responsibility system for all packaging, plastic and paper packaging materials, and would set up a product accountability association that would collect fees from the different producers, and the fees would go to reimburse or offset the fees paid by municipalities. So as was mentioned, shifting some of the costs from the municipalities to the producers to do end-of-life management of packaging. And so, this would be a huge, system shift for the state of Massachusetts, and I think any state where it's happening. And the folks who are big proponents of it, they'll say that it works, and it's in operation in various Canadian provinces and other countries, in Europe. And I mean, I think from the MMA perspective, we're not there yet in getting something like this passed and implemented in Massachusetts. It would take a while to really figure out, you know, how to do something that's like really packaging wide and not just, you know, focusing on specific product categories. And so, you know, we engaged with these bills around packaging, but they didn't, you know, gain so much traction in the legislature this session, you know, but as you probably know, it often takes years, if not decades, for things to move forward, and they get, you know, amended and changed as they move through the legislative process. So, you know, I think that these conversations about EPR are something that we're still going to be having. There was an EPR related summit, you know, a year or so ago. They'll do like a salon for legislators to learn about the issue, and so, you know, really just trying to advance the conversation. And because, you know, EPR and product stewardship are terms that not many legislators might be familiar with, and, you know, let alone the general public. So just like starting the conversation is, you know, can be just as important as a first step. And then, you know, we also haven't really moved forward with product specific legislation, not in the way that was described in Vermont, but this session there were proposals related to mattresses and paint and, you know, some other more like hazardous material categories, and nothing has been passed yet. And even the mattresses was for like a study commission and not actually setting up a program. And so some of these things do exist on, you know, local or regional levels, or are facilitated by, you know, a nonprofit or, you know, social entrepreneurship organization. But I'm speaking about, there's no, you know, state-run program or, you know, mandatory recycling of mattresses. You can still, you know, put your mattress on the curb on the right day, you know, to just go to the landfill. And so, you know, but even if this bill that is in play, you know, passed, it would only create a study commission and wouldn't establish, you know, a full program. So, you know, even with these product specific proposals, we still do have a ways to go in getting them implemented in Massachusetts. But, you know, each time around, I think that they gain more traction. So I'll move on from EPR and product stewardship. Next slide, please. So also, you know, as Cathy mentioned about bans or restrictions on single-use plastics, so the thing that has gained the most traction in Massachusetts is plastic bag bans. And so we have 351 cities and towns, and we've now seen approximately 139 of them pass local plastic bag bans. And so that's, you know, a decision of their local, you know, deliberative body, and, you know, it's considered a bylaw or an ordinance. And there have been, you know, several proposals for state level plastic bag ban, and the MMA decided this year to support a state, or, you know, possibly 2019 to support a state level, you know, statewide ban on plastic bags. And, you know, so that was moving through the legislative process. And, you know, as it happens, you know, one variation of it that came out of the committee would preempt local authority to, you know, maintain the bans in the way that they have when it was just, you know, a local bylaw or ordinance. And that was something that was concerning to us. You know, if there's questions about that during the Q&A, I can go into more detail. It might not be necessary right now, but, you know, for folks who are really, you know, in the weeds on legislation, you know, the devil is in the details. And so it's really important, you know, what the bill actually says and what impact it would have. And so the MMA had some concerns over changes that were made from the original bill. And right now there is no, you know, two-branch, you know, final statewide plastic bag bill. And I also, you know, COVID-19 really disrupted that particular legislation because, you know, the governor ended up suspending the local plastic bag bans, you know, statewide because of concerns about contamination, and recently reinstated them. And I think that right now, when, you know, feelings about both contamination, but also just like the necessity of folks to, you know, go to the store and get things, you know, for quarantine, there isn't really the same appetite for a statewide ban on plastic bags right now that there seemed to be, you know, 6 months ago. And I think that the same is really true for these other single-use plastic categories that, you know, we've seen a lot of like rolling back of, we don't have statewide bans on straws or polystyrene, or other single-use plastics. Every legislative session, there are proposals, on polystyrene, on straws, even just making straws, I think it's called straws upon request, where a establishment can only provide a straw if somebody requests it. They can't just automatically put straws in people's drinks or have them on the table. And so what we've seen is a lot of these local versus state level approaches where it is within local authority to be able to pass some of these bylaws or ordinances on an individual community level, and it's much more difficult to get something passed statewide, which requires the legislature to approve it, and it requires the buy-in of communities and also industry across the whole state. And even though we're a small state, there is definitely a diversity of opinion when it comes to this, and different regions, and the viability of doing these things. And for folks who are really trying to phase out or eliminate single-use plastic, the COVID, I think, has really put a wrench in that, at least for now, because of with all of the outdoor dining and things like that, the emphasis is really on using single-use disposable things, understandably to protect public health, but there's really concerns about this is going to increase our trash, and that we're rolling back some of the inroads that we've made on reducing the use of harmful single-use plastic products. So I'll move on to the next slide. So also talking about composting or food waste. So in Massachusetts, food waste represents about 1/3 of the total waste stream. And this was included in Cathy's slide, where she listed the food waste laws in each of, I think, the New England states. And so our state has a commercial food waste ban, so it's only for commercial entities, and it's currently at producing more than 1 ton per week, and there is a big push to lower that to 1/2 ton per week. Would require the companies or establishments to compost if they produce any more than 1/2 ton per week. And that is something that actually, it doesn't have to go through the legislature. The Department of Environmental Protection can lower that as part of a regulatory action. And we don't have anywhere near the the food scrap law that Cathy talked about in Vermont, but for all of the things that she said about the real importance of increasing residential composting, that's just as relevant in Massachusetts, which is less of a rural state, in terms of opportunities for like farm-based composting and things like that, but or even backyard composting for folks. But the state MassDEP is working to expand composting where they can, where there's grant opportunities to provide to individual municipalities to do a pilot project or to roll out residential composting. So we're seeing this on a piecemeal basis, but not statewide. And I think that if it's going to be something that requires significant, state resources or municipal resources to do, it's not going to be easy to pass, over concerns about costs associated with this. And so, even though the need to reduce, food waste is something that's on the radar of obviously folks at DEP and municipal officials who are concerned about the tonnage of their trash, because they're paying with these contracts per ton, there's still this complicated cost benefit calculus of investing in composting programs, which currently on a municipal level really only exist in like our most kind of progressive communities, like your Cambridge and your Newton, Massachusetts, where like they've rolled out municipal-wide composting, but not in other parts of the state. So I'll move on to the next slide. I also wanted to mention the zero waste movement, which is something that, we hear a lot about, especially with, the relationships I've developed with folks at the Conservation Law Foundation, and also the City of Boston has a zero waste plan. So, the principles of this zero waste movement, when applied, statewide or regionally, instead of, just, you might have heard like an individual might take a zero waste approach and try to, eliminate the waste that they are producing as an individual. But, on a macro level, the emphasis is on waste reduction and diversion as an alternative to expanding landfills and to incineration. And so, there is, I think, a big push-pull between the zero waste movement and industry folks around the decision to increase our incineration capacity, to think about how do we possibly do landfill expansion, and that there is a belief on the zero waste side that if only we took steps as individuals and collectively to reduce our waste and to divert food waste, as has been talked about, to divert these different product categories like mattresses and paint and dozens of other categories, if we really if we stopped using single-use plastic, things like that, then there wouldn't be a need to go in these other directions. And there's this belief that industry rather than the public should bear greater financial and operational responsibility for end-of-life materials management. And I saw earlier that there was a question in the chat box about, wouldn't that result in, industry or companies passing along higher costs to the public? And that's a really good question. I'm not going to answer it now, and I don't really have a good answer because that's something that very well might play out if financial burden is transferred more to the industry or corporate side than to the public. Some of those increased costs could be passed along to the public. And so, I'm not sharing this information to endorse a zero waste, philosophy, and it's not something that the MMA has endorsed, but just to introduce some of the conversation that, we hear. And I know we're running low on time. I want to make sure there's time for questions for both Cathy and myself. So I'm going to just move on to the next slide. And briefly say that our state agency, MassDEP, has a big role to play in helping to support our cities and towns and the whole state related to recycling and solid waste issues. They offer a grant program for municipalities, which lots of our municipalities have been the beneficiaries of, to do all sorts of things like educating the residents about proper sorting of recycling, to setting up pilot composting programs. So the grant program is really a really valuable resource. The MassDEP also has a solid waste advisory committee. The MMA serves on it, as do many other stakeholders. And we meet quarterly and help to weigh in on regulatory decisions and just policy decisions, and to hear updates from MassDEP that we can then bring back to our constituencies, so that I can bring back to the municipal officials that we work with. And most importantly, DEP is working on a solid waste master plan for the next decade, for 2020 to 2030. And so there is a draft plan. They did public hearings back in the fall, and they've decided to reopen the public hearing window and to focus on the impacts from COVID that might have changed things in the master plan, and also focus a little bit more on environmental justice communities and on impacts related to climate change. And so the MMA is planning to weigh in again on this master plan. So this is the state's plan for how they manage their solid waste and recycling for the next decade. And so it's a really important document, a really important guiding document. And we're grateful for the opportunities as a stakeholder to weigh in on that and to help to shape it. And next slide. So I think that this is my last slide, and each of these topics could be its own discussion or webinar. And so I just put these on to say that there's so much that I didn't talk about in my presentation, but that are debates or conversations going on around solid waste and recycling topic. And, you know, we are an advocacy organization, and so, you know, we're able to engage in these debates a lot more than, you know, a state agency would, which has to remain you know, more neutral on things like this. But, you know, lots of conversations about landfill closures in Massachusetts, you know, decisions about expanding them versus trucking waste or recycling to other states versus incineration. You have a very strong pro-incineration and very strong anti-incineration, you know, camps in Massachusetts. Questions about rebuilding in-state and regional recycling markets, because a lot of those markets closed when everything shifted over to China. And so there's, you know, conversations about bringing back bottling plants and paper, you know, pulp, and things like that. So, you know, another question is, does the state have any obligation or role to play in subsidizing municipal recycling contracts or in propping up markets in some way, or, you know, developing markets? You know, we have a lot of municipal officials who ask, you know, can the state provide us with subsidies, because we really can't shoulder the burden of these high recycling contracts, and what are we supposed to do about that? You know, because it's mandatory to recycle as it is in Vermont also, but we can't afford it. Questions about pay-as-you-throw as a model. Pay-as-you-throw is optional. It exists in some communities and not in others. Some folks want to make it statewide, but it's not, you know, beloved everywhere. Questions about expanding the bottle bill. There's the pro bottle bill expansion camp, and then the bottling industry, which has concerns over expanding the bottle bill. There are questions about environmental justice, about where are facilities located and who bears the brunt of that. And then, you know, the biggest question of all that I'm sure a lot of folks have is, like, is recycling actually being recycled right now? And maybe that's a question that, you know, residents have more than folks in the industry who are actually doing this work and, you know, are on the ground and know what's happening there. But, you know, it's a big question that we hear. So I believe that that's all that I have. I think the next slide is just, you know, thank you and questions. And so, yeah, I'd love to turn it back to Heather.
Excellent. Thank you, Ariela, for your presentation. And yes, I would like to transfer over to questions for both Cathy and Ariela. And it sounds like it'll be best for volume if one of you has to be muted until you wish to speak. So stay muted until you wish to speak. The first question I had, I think Ariela brought up, and I can put it out to, I think this was originally to Cathy, which is one of the benefits of EPR is shifting costs. So don't manufacturers just pass the cost to consumers with increased prices? So Cathy, would you like to start with that?
Sure, thanks. And that really depends on two things, and that is the model of the EPR legislation that was passed and implemented and the product. And let me give you two examples to kind of explain that. With our electronics waste EPR program, Vermont was, I think, the 23rd state in the country to adopt used electronic EPR. And that legislation it was silent on the cost, that basically the cost is on the manufacturer. So it's up to the manufacturer to determine, do they increase the cost of the product, or do they just basically embed it or whatnot. And with that, and with most electronics being sold, you know, nationally through internet sales or big box stores or whatnot, that Vermonters really did not see any increase in the costs when they purchased the electronics, yet they had the benefit of having this material then easily, conveniently collected and properly managed, and the cost of that was borne by the manufacturers. So that's one model. A separate model is our paint EPR program, where that law was passed. There is a fee that is charged all the way down to the consumer for each container of paint that they purchase, and then those fees go into a pool of funds managed by Paint Care for the proper recycling of the unused paint that comes back into the system. So that's two different models where, yes, the consumer is paying for it, or with paint, or it's just an embedded fee and it may not even show up in the cost of the product, such as e-waste. But the important part is it no longer is on the tax base, and it's on the product that the consumer buys. And so the consumer, even if it's on the product, then it's a full cost accounting of the management of that material.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate that. Then we had another question that came in that can really go to both of you. What interest groups were, I think this was referring to the Vermont ban, but what interest groups were most opposed to the single-use plastic bans, and how were those concerns addressed and overcome? So if both of you want to take turns talking about bans, maybe Cathy, go ahead.
Sure. So in Vermont, we had for many years introduction of bills for plastic bag ban, and they had been opposed by multiple groups, and most notably the Retail Association. However, when some municipalities in Vermont started to adopt individual ordinances, that changed the perspective of Vermont Retailers Association, because they did not want to have to implement multiple different programs in the state. And so they actually came over to advocate for a statewide program. So it was so interesting to see how that motivated a change in that advocacy group. Those that were in favor of it, of course, were the environmental groups for sure. As well as, we had a variety of solid waste managers, because plastic bags are tanglers at MRFs. They blow around at landfills. They really cause problems for people that are managing waste. And so we didn't have much opposition once municipalities started adopting their own programs.
Excellent, thank you, Cathy. Ariela, do you want to chime in about?
Yeah, I'll expand on that from the Massachusetts perspective to say that when we had the hearings for the statewide ban, you also hear from the manufacturers of plastic bags. So, either the lobbyists or the representatives and the folks themselves who are the producers of these bags. Obviously, it's understandable that they want to defend the product that they're producing. And then similarly, with the proposal to have a fee on paper bags, we also heard from representative from the paper bag manufacturing industry concerns about, what adding a fee to that would do. And also a bit interestingly, we heard from folks who felt like the tax was regressive on lower income people, because there is an assumption that you can just bring reusable bags, that everyone has those. Also that a 5-cent fee on paper if you forget to forget your bags, or you have to pop in somewhere and you don't have a bag, that that's nothing to folks to absorb, but anything that feels like nothing for folks to absorb might be more of a financial burden on lower income folks. So so I'd say that rounds out who are concerned about or opposed to the ban.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for your presentations. In the interest of time, we're going to switch over, but I want to thank Ariela and Cathy for stepping in, and I wanted to thank our sponsors for the summer webinar series. We would like to thank the Interstate Refrigerant Recovery Incorporated, Schnitzer, and the USDA. I want to remind everyone that the post-webinar survey will launch immediately after this webinar. It'll also appear in your email inbox tomorrow. As a reminder, we welcome feedback, of course. Our next webinar series will continue on Friday, August 7th, when we'll explore, that'll be noon to 1 p.m., we'll explore the 6th R, repair, with Ollie Kutara and Cassandra Hemingway. and from Vermont. And then on next Wednesday, on August 12th, we will examine Educate, Don't Contaminate with Lucy Perkins and Matt Grondin from EcoMaine. I want to thank you all for attending and have a happy summer from NRRA.